Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains infamous. And today, we are going to discuss a bit of a forgotten story when it comes to Pearl Harbor, namely the attack on Pearl Harbor specifically. Now, I'm sure the vast majority of you are perfectly familiar with the attack on Pearl Harbor, but I bet you didn't know that one of the ships that was lost during the attack actually was an ex-battleship. No, not a current battleship, a former battleship. This is the tale of the USS Utah. USS Utah was laid down in March of 1909 and launched in December of that same year. She was officially completed August 1911. She was one of two members of the Florida-class dreadnaught battleships, the other one being, well, the USS Florida. They were the first United States battleship to be designed to utilize steam turbine engines. This was something that had been experimented with the preceding Delaware-class ships, but the Florida classes were the ones initially developed to use them from the beginning. Now, I'll happily give you an abridged version of the USS Utah's service leading up to Pearl Harbor, but I gotta be honest, it's not that exciting. She and her sister Florida were the first ships to arrive during the United States occupation of Veracruz in 1914 during the Mexican Revolution. They both sent ashore landing parties, but that was about it. She was involved in World War I once we were dragged into that conflict. She was stationed at Berehaven in Bantry Bay, Ireland. Her job at that point was to protect convoys from potential German surface raiders, but to be honest, she never really had to do it. By the point the United States was involved in World War I, the vast majority of the naval conflicts were over. That war had devolved into a land war, with Germany mostly on the defensive. Very few naval engagements happened from there on, so the Utah didn't really get a chance to shine at all during World War I. When that war ended, well, it was the 20s. There wasn't really a lot going on in terms of warfare that would need battleships. In 1931, she was finally demilitarized. Her sister, Florida, was scrapped, but Utah was retained as a target ship. Target ships were actually a critically important part of naval training. They're used for seaborne target or naval gunnery practice, sometimes even for weapons testing. She was redesignated AG-16, and the vast majority of her armaments were stripped off. It sounds like a really sad end for the USS Utah, but her story isn't over here. She was still filling a very necessary military role. She was old enough at this point that she could be considered a little bit obsolete, so her battle capabilities would have been questionable. Her being retained to train new recruits how to handle the new weapons for other, newer ships is still an admirable practice in this context, and it's still arguably a better fate than her sister Florida, who, like I said, was simply scrapped. And she wasn't just used for target practice either. She was also equipped with numerous anti-aircraft guns of a wide variety for the purposes of training crews on how to utilize them. So while she may have been designated as a target ship, she was also used as a training ship too, so it wasn't like her job was entirely just to get shot at. But that was the role she would take on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, creating the main catalyst for the United States entering World War II, one of the deadliest global conflicts in history. The goal of the Japanese during the attack on Pearl Harbor was to cripple the United States Pacific Fleet. This would give them a significant edge in pushing our forces back. During the attack, they would manage to kill over 2,000 people, damage and sink numerous ships, damage 4 battleships, and sink 4 battleships, and 1 ex-battleship. Wait, why would they target the Utah? This doesn't really make sense at face value. Sure, the Utah was at Pearl Harbor at the time. She was anchored off the western side of Ford Island, but she was obviously away from the other actual in-service battleships, and the Japanese were well aware that the Utah was decommissioned. She was not considered a threat or a target in any way. In fact, when the attack commenced, Captain Mitsuo Fushida, who was the leader of the first wave of attacking aircraft, specifically said that the Utah was not to be attacked, as she was a decommissioned target vessel. She would serve them no purpose and would only serve to waste their ammunition. The Japanese had to traverse nearly the entire length of the Pacific Ocean to reach Pearl Harbor. They had limited torpedoes to utilize during the attack because the assault hinged on the notion that we were completely unprepared for it. If any torpedoes were used on non-targets, it would be deemed a complete waste. The attack had been well planned, but it would require nearly flawless execution by their pilots. They would have to target actual, legitimate targets, not ships whose job had actually been to be shot at for the last decade. But the USS Utah still managed to serve in some capacity by being very confusing. During the chaos of the assault, a young Japanese pilot mistook the Utah for an actual active battleship and launched a torpedo at her. This caused a bit of a chain reaction when it came to Japanese pilots. Because that pilot had shot at the Utah, well, he must be right, therefore I am also going to launch my torpedo. In fact, a total of 6 torpedoes were completely wasted in shots against the Utah, which, I cannot stress this enough, was not an active battleship. She was commissioned solely for the purpose of being a target. To make it worse, out of the 6, only 2 managed to hit the Utah, completely wasting ordnance that could have otherwise been used on actual legitimate targets. By absorbing this damage, the Utah actually may have saved 1 or 2 other ships from destruction, maybe even more. And on board the ship at the time, well, there was a significant amount of crew. For target practice, the Utah could be radio controlled, but for training anti-air guns and moving around normally, they didn't necessarily rely on that. There were sailors on board when she was attacked, and while there are plenty of stories of heroism during Pearl Harbor, one of them did take place on board USS Utah. Chief Watertender Peter Tomich was on the ship when she was struck by the torpedoes. The Utah was holding her own for a little bit, but she was listing badly. Tomich, who was a Croatian immigrant and a World War I veteran, immediately ordered his crew to abandon ship. However, he himself decided to return to his post. The reason? The steam boilers. They needed to be secured and shut down in order to prevent a possible explosion that could have killed many of the sailors trying desperately to escape the capsizing Utah. His actions delayed this long enough for the vast majority of the Utah's crew to escape. When Utah rolled over and sank after Tomich was last seen, she took him with her, as well as 57 other men. But her story wasn't over just yet. As soon as the survivors reached shore, the ship's senior officer, Commander Solomon Isquith, heard knocking from men that were trapped inside the Utah. He immediately called for volunteers to get a cutting torch from the badly damaged cruiser Raleigh, which was nearby, in an attempt to cut into the Utah's hull and free the trapped men. They actually succeeded a bit at this, pulling out 4 of their men. 461 of the total crew of the Utah managed to survive. Peter Tomich, whose heroism had cost him his life, was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for what he had done. Although, interestingly, they couldn't actually locate his family to give them the medal. It went unclaimed until 2006, when they finally located a relative, and the award was presented to them in a ceremony held in Split, Croatia. As for the Utah herself, well, there was an attempt to right her again and salvage her to some extent, or at least be able to recover the bodies of those that did die. But their only attempt at doing so just didn't work. It probably could have been accomplished had they put significant effort into it, but the Utah had done her job. She was a target ship, and even if they righted her, she had no real military value at that point. It was much more logical to put the effort into raising one of the 4 actual battleships that had been sunk. As a result, the Utah remained where she was. She was formally placed out of commission on the 5th of September 1944 and stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on the 13th of November that same year. Despite only being there to serve as a target, she had done that valiantly, and she was awarded a single battle star for her brief service during World War II. The bodies of the men trapped inside were never recovered, and Utah remains in that same location to this day. serving as a war grave. A large memorial was erected in 1972 just off Ford Island near the Utah's remains, and is considered part of the Pearl Harbor National Memorial. However, unlike the Arizona, which is considered open to the public, the Utah's memorial is restricted only to individuals with a military identification. A color guard stands watch over the Utah, and she, along with the Arizona, were added to the National Historic Landmark Registry in the 5th of May, 1989. And as of 2008, 7 former crewmen who were on board the Utah when she went down were cremated and, per their wishes, had their ashes interred inside the wreck with their former crewmates. While her story is just one of many that happened on the 7th of December 1941, I think it's worth saying that she should never be forgotten. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Somedude 267, Brightline Blue, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Tribal Typhoon, Master of None, Josh Johnson, and Lock Kraken. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.